The European Union is facing two crises at the same time. The war in Ukraine after the Russian invasion, as well as the situation in Gaza after the Hamas terror attack. In both conflicts, disinformation and fake news play a role. I'm joined now by EU Commission's Vice President Vera Jourova. Welcome to DW, Ms. Jourova.
Thank you very much for inviting me and good morning.
Thank you very much. Madam Vice President, you recently spoke of disinformation as a war of ideas against democracy. There are more and more reports right now about disinformation and even cyber warfare in the Middle East. Do you have that on your radar?
Of course, we are following what's happening because what's happening in real life, and real life is not nice at this moment when we see so much violence and killing. It reflects in online sphere, and it also what's happening in online sphere has influence on real life. So there is an interaction. I would even say some kind of spiral of hate speech, hatred, and disinformation, which we try to minimize as for the impact on the society.
You say you try to minimize that. How can I imagine that?
We, first of all, have a discussion and agreement with the big platforms, which is called Code of Practice Against Disinformation, which all the big players signed. Twitter left, but all the others are in. And they made a commitment that they will invest in fact-checking and in delivering the facts and trustworthy information to the users of the networks. And of course, you yourself mentioned those two crises, Russian aggression and situation in Gaza. This is generating avalanche of disinformation, but also terrorist content in the sense of celebrating terrorism and hate speech and hatred against Jews, especially in the EU. So we appear in the epicenter of information war at this moment. And we, when I say we, I mean European citizens and us who represent the citizens. We cannot make a good change without active cooperation from the side of the digital platforms.
You mentioned that this is taking place here in Europe as well, the fake news about the Middle East conflict. How can I imagine that in practice?
I would not speak at the first place about fake news. Because fake news, it's how to define it. It's also some gossip or some conspiracy theory, which honestly is not so dangerous. But here we see big wave of hatred, hostility, and verbal violence, which is spilling over to real life. Look at the streets. Look at the David stars on the houses of the Jewish citizens. So I don't want to blame the digital platforms and digital space for everything we see in the streets and in our hearts. But there is big amplification going on of hatred and violence.
Do you have any evidence who is behind the disinformation, the hate speech and the violence that you observe in the social media?
When it comes to disinformation against Ukraine, and connected with the war in Ukraine, we obviously see the pro-Kremlin sources, which can be defined concretely or not. We see the direction from which it is coming to Europe. In case of Middle East war, we are of course watching or following the sources from where it is coming. But for me, more dangerous than the source, and the source may be Hamas itself, because they need to spread their narrative. The more dangerous are the proxies of Hamas, those who are spreading it further. And these are also European actors. So I will not be concrete, but of course we have quite good data showing what is happening in disinformation scene at this moment.
I do have to ask, nevertheless, because you mentioned you have an idea who the sources are in the Middle East conflict of the fake news and then the proxies. So there have been reports that there's also Killnet from Russia involved, for example. Could you confirm that, or could you elaborate a bit on that?
I cannot confirm that because I did not see the database of the possible sources, but it's for our external service to be precise and to give us more or less aggregated data so that we can take political decisions.
Well, then let me ask a bit differently. Who would have an interest in spreading these fake news and why?
Well, there are two big interests. One, to do harm to those who are defending. Those who are defending in these conflicts are Ukraine and Israel. For me, this is a clear-cut case. It doesn't mean that I am not supporting the humanitarian aid for the people living in Gaza. Yeah? These two things are not in contradiction. So the interest is clear to do harm to these two countries. The second goal is more connected with us, Europeans, because over several years already we see very well coordinated and concentrated attacking of European public opinion and the atmosphere in the society to distract us, to sow fear, to increase uncertainty among the citizens. Because what we see, those who have the tendency to believe disinformation, they live in high level of uncertainty, they fear, they do not have trustworthy information, so they also believe these fake news. Mm-hmm. And this is important, I have to mention that. Those who do not have trustworthy information, it's our obligation, of the people who are in the lead, to provide the citizens with information so that the uncertainty and fear is not that high.
You mentioned Russia already and the pro-Kremlin trolls. Which role does Russian disinformation practically play in the war in Ukraine, and have you seen an increase of Russian disinformation?
One lucky day after the war will be over, which I hope Ukraine will win, we will take lessons from this war. This is the war which is the first of its kind digital war, because also the level of maturity or advancement of for the digital use is one of these decisive factors. On this front, I think Ukraine is winning. But you didn't ask about that. In this war, words are used as weapons. Russia is the world champion in propaganda, in using lies, using fake news and disinformation, which are verifiable lies. That's why the verification and fact-checking is so important in defense. And so, of course, they are using this against Ukraine and against all of us in this war, because this is a very important part of their military doctrine. We saw it already after the invasion to Crimea in 2014. And Putin did not hide it. He even indicated things in Munich, sometimes in 2017. And we saw it from public sources that disinformation is the part of the military doctrine. So disinformation is now being used as the weapon against all of us.
So you have quite some experience in watching Russian disinformation, so to say, since already the annexation of Crimea. And you mentioned it yourself, Twitter, now known as X, left the voluntary code or the voluntary pact. In September, you announced that X is the biggest source of fake news and disinformation. And much of it is, in fact, coming from Russia also there. So what are you going to, in concrete terms, do about this?
I was not happy when Twitter left, I have to say. and I was also clear about it publicly. And recently I invited X to come back to the code of practice against disinformation. I will see whether it will be reflected somehow.
What did they say?
Well, that they are considering, and for them the code, as they said, was too demanding exercise because it also contains reporting and so on. But I see that sometimes there is something good on bad things. X or Twitter showed to us the difference between the platforms which are moderating the content, which are removing illegal content, especially hate speech, extremism, terrorism, child pornography, and the platform which is not doing that, or which is only very mildly, superficially doing that. Now we see the difference. And I think also the bosses of Twitter can see that they appear in isolation. I am not counting Telegram, it's another story, it is a smaller network. But Twitter, belonging to the very large online platforms, now shows how it looks like when the provider of the space does not care about the content. And I speak about illegal content, not disinformation.
Does this make you feel like you're fighting on two fronts? On the one hand, against the social media platform that left, and on the other hand, the disinformation itself?
I would say disinformation requires fight. We must stop being naive. Freedom of speech is a great thing, but it's not absolute in Europe. And when we fight against disinformation, we should. I should always define what it is. What is the evil in it? We do not fight against some minor rumors of, as I said, conspiracy theories. We fight against disinformation as the production of coordinated groups, creating very efficient, well-targeted campaigns with the intention to do harm to the society. There must be these three things present. This is what we care about, because such combination, coordination, well-targeting, good targeting, and intention to do harm can be dangerous for security of EU citizens. We see it in the streets now. And also free and fair elections, so democratic processes. I have these two public interests in mind when I do anything against disinformation.
Before we get to the elections, and you mentioned Russia before, that they want to create chaos in the European Union. And why? What is their agenda? Why are they doing that?
Two reasons. Again, I would say that Russia fears of democratic societies and democratic neighborhood. What if the Russian people will become fed up of his style of governing? Tsar, who can do everything. So it's one reason, fear of democracy as such. So Putin is doing two things, in fact, suppressing everyone who wants to speak up in Russia. There are people in jail, and spreading the disinformation and creating unrest and nervousness in the EU. So it's one thing, fear of from democracy. The second thing is Putin desperately needs to see the European citizens to say stop to their governments, stop in supporting Ukraine. Because this is what hurt him. He did not count with such solidarity and also such common sense, and I would call it historical instinct in Europe, that we will collectively start supporting Ukraine, because it's also our security and strategic interest. So two things, and they are strong enough that he will continue and invest more and more money in it.
are you there already for the last EU elections? You warned that there's Russian influence, and now you said that there would also continue more and more money, and you're worried about the European elections. What can you do? What are you doing to prevent Russian influence for the upcoming elections next year?
We can do something. We cannot do everything because it's in the hands of European citizens. It's true that I was the first one who named Russia as the main source of meddling into the elections. It was in 2020, and that's why I appeared on the Russian sanctions list, by the way. For the next elections, well, it will depend on efficiency of our method, especially the Code of Practice Against Disinformation and the Digital Services Act, which obliges the platforms to take care of the content. No censorship. Again, when it comes to disinformation, we speak about fact-checking mainly. And also the independent media will have to accelerate their work against disinformation. Because in my view, big role for the independent media is to deliver the facts to the people. So strengths and of the independent media, of the public service media in the EU, and delivering the facts before the elections. And the third thing is, and it's a very warning paradox. In the EU, there are a lot of political forces which are flying on the campaign paid by Putin.
Like which ones?
Well, we saw it in Slovakia, for instance, yeah? When we saw some political parties which were using or harvesting even the atmosphere created by extremely intensive Russian campaign, pro-Russian campaign.
Do you see other European actors doing that?
I think AfD is doing that as well, if you want to be concrete. There might be some others. I will not name all of them. I still need to go to the countries from time to time, so I cannot offend everyone. But we have sufficient data showing that even without simple repetition of the Russian narratives, the political powers can only harvest the nervousness and the atmosphere the Russian propaganda is creating.
So this brings me to my last question. Is this a fight the EU can win?
We have to win because I believe we have a good, sorry, it's a marketing sentence, good product to sell.
But can you?
I think that when we look at, for instance, migration, everybody wants to live in Europe. Nobody is leaving. It applies to the people, it applies to the countries. And I think that this is a very good, how to say, sign of quality of European democracy. But at the same time, if we do not improve European democracy, if we do not increase trust of people, we might lose. We might lose. And so we are doing a lot of things. What are the three main critical points and sources of distrust, which I see from my job? Sometimes really miserable communication, that we are not able to explain in a simple way to people what's going on and what we plan for them. The second thing is corruption. And the third thing are the undeserved privileges of the political layer. That's why I am now working on the ethics body for the EU institutions. But this is what you didn't ask about.
Yeah, I think this would lead us to another whole different topic. I thank you very much for the interview at this point.
Thank you.